Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of us as GU Politics. My name is Javon Price, and I'm a senior in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics with a focus in security. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I've been heavily involved with GU Politics, first as a member of Michael Steele's student strategy team in 2016, and culminating in my current position as the campus ambassador on the Student Leadership Council. In addition to my experience with GU Politics, I've also been widely involved in other student organizations on campus, such as the Georgetown University College Republicans. I've been on the editorial board at the Hoya, and I also serve as the director of external affairs for an organization called Gen Z GOP, which seeks to chart a new vision for the Republican Party by establishing a palatable alternative to the political left. I am pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Gerald Seib, executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Seib is the author of the new book, We Should Have Seen It Coming, chronicling the conservative movement's rise to dominance in national politics and the evolution to a populist movement that brought Donald Trump to power. We are thrilled to have Mr. Seib here to discuss his book with us. And lastly, before we begin, we invite everyone to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #PoliticalPageturners and by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. Tonight's event will be moderated by GU Politics Executive Director Mo Lathy, who is ready to kick us off.
Thanks, Javon. Always appreciate your participation and your leadership, not just at GU Politics, but across campus. Thanks for the great introduction. And thank all of you for tuning in tonight. I'm really excited to have this conversation, both because of the content, but also because of our guest. Jerry is someone I've known for quite a number of years now. Back before I returned to the Hilltop, when I was still wearing my old partisan jersey. And then, of course, through some of my wearing my political pundit hat, and of course through this gig. And I've always found him to be one of the more insightful, fair, political analysts in the media industry. He's covered a lot of White Houses, covered a lot of presidents, has been around the game for a long time. And that's why I think this conversation tonight, I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with tonight. As we enter these final weeks of the 2020 presidential campaign, there's still a lot of people who walk around, scratch their heads whenever they hear the name Donald Trump and say, I still don't get it. I still don't understand how he got elected in the first place. And I hear that from both Democrats and Republicans. So Jerry, we're hoping you can help us make sense of it. Thanks for joining us tonight. Jerry, I think you're on mute.
Yep, there you go.
Nope, back on.
Okay, how about that?
There we go.
All right. So, well, first of all, thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. Yeah, Mo, you and I have walked through many trenches during political wars, so it's nice to get out of the trenches a little bit here and have a higher level conversation, I hope.
Yeah.
But no, you asked the right question. Why did I do the book? I did the book because I wanted to know the answer to that same question. I mean, all of us who lived through 2016, or at least everybody that I know who lived through 2016, at some point or another said, how did we get here? And even more so after Election Day on 2016. I wouldn't say I ever predicted Donald Trump wouldn't win, but I don't think I predicted that he would win with a whole lot of confidence. Yet it happened. And I think even more important, he won barely. He lost the popular vote and won the Electoral College. More important for this story in some ways is the fact that he did storm through the Republican primaries as the leading contender from start to finish. So whatever the national embrace of Donald Trump was, the Republican embrace was huge and much bigger than anybody would have predicted. And how did that happen? And so I got curious. I started writing some columns for the Journal, where I write a weekly column, trying to address this question. Never was very satisfied with the answer. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought you had to go back to, and I decided 1979. I became very interested in 1979, which was the year that set up the Ronald Reagan victory in 1980. In 1979, the wheels were sort of falling off the cart in some ways. There was stagflation and gas lines and an energy crisis and Iranian students taking over an embassy in Tehran. And people thought the wheels were falling off. And the door was open and in walked Ronald Reagan. And to me, and that's, by the way, when I walked into Washington too, I arrived here in 1980. So for me, the story of the next 4 decades from that point to Donald Trump's victory in 2016 was really the story of the conservative movement, which was in some ways the most interesting and I think the most powerful movement through that period. Yet somehow it went from Ronald Reagan, a really true conservative, to Donald Trump, who is many things, but he is not a conservative. He's a populist and a nationalist. How did that happen? So that's what I tried to do, is go back and figure out the answer to that question. The main answer I found, though, which is reflected in the title of the book, is we should have seen it coming. There were lots of signs along the way. And by the way, in both parties, as you and I were discussing before we came on air here, there were lots of signs along the way of a populist nationalist feeling taking root and then rising up. And I think that went from bottom to top, not the other way around. And a lot of us either ignored them or dismissed them or misread them or rationalized them away. In a way, the door was open and Donald Trump just walked through it.
Just a reminder to our audience, Jerry and I are going to continue our conversation for a little bit before we invite you in. If, as a member of the Georgetown community, if you are interested in joining the conversation, please hit the chat button, or excuse me, the Q&A button at the bottom, and you can start populating your questions at any point. Someone from our team will let you know when we've selected your question, and then be camera ready so you can ask Jerry your question directly. So Jerry, I want to follow up on that, right, and look into this a little bit more, because when I think back to 2016, right, I mean, Republican primaries, and I would argue as a former Democratic hack, even more so than in Democratic primaries, Republican primaries have for a very long time been a battle over ideologies at the presidential level, right? You might have sort of your mainstream, your mainstream Wall Street Republicans battling your evangelical Republicans, battling your libertarian Republicans, but it was more of an ideological divide. And when I think back to 2016, you saw all the hallmarks of that shaping up, right? With Jeb Bush versus Marco Rubio versus, Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. And I remember Donald Trump coming down that escalator and just basically saying, to hell with all of that, right? The whole system is rigged. And every one of his opponents said, yeah, but you're not a real conservative, buddy, thinking that would just be enough to dispense with him. And looking at primary after primary, the Republican electorate was like, what? Like that? I don't even know what that word means anymore. Right? How did folks miss that so badly?
Well, it's a very good point. And it is, I think the reason so many people missed it is that I was accustomed, covered every presidential election since 1980, many of them on the Republican side, was expecting the ideological struggle. Like, you're a Reagan conservative, you're too moderate. And we weren't prepared to deal with Donald Trump, who has no ideology. He's not a conservative. I talked to Newt Gingrich about this, and I asked various people along the way, is he a conservative? And Newt Gingrich said, no, he's not a conservative. He's an anti-liberal. He hates liberals, but that he has no ideology. We went back and looked during the campaign at the Wall Street Journal and found that over the preceding 2 decades, Donald Trump was registered as a Democrat, and then as an independent, and then as a Republican, and then as an independent again, and then as a Republican. He spent as much time as a Democrat almost over the previous 2 decades as he had as a Republican, and he'd given more money to Democrats than the Republicans. He has no ideology. I think that the paradigm that we were all used to was exactly the one you described, Mo, which is, where does he fit on the ideological spectrum? And Trump shows up and says, it doesn't matter to me. I do not care. I do not have an ideology. I think what he had was an attitude. And his attitude was, the establishment is in it for its own gain. It's screwing you. It's not worked. The fix is in the free trade movement, which was embraced by both parties, Democrat and Republican. The openness to immigration, which was embraced by both parties. Both parties wanted basically to do what the Republican conservatives would call amnesty for illegal aliens. That's going to hurt you. I'm here to bust up the establishment. That's not an ideology, that's an attitude. And the reason I think it worked, and this is where I think a lot of people missed what was going to happen, was the Republican Party was a fundamentally different place by 2016. You had had 2 decades of people moving into the Republican Party from the center of the country, and I mean that geographically, but also figuratively, working class Americans from the Midwest, lower income, less educated people who moved into the Republican Party for cultural reasons. Didn't like the social drift of the Democratic Party, liked prayer in schools, didn't like abortion rights, didn't like transgender rights. They moved into the Republican Party for cultural reasons. And having arrived, they weren't happy with the economic gospel that they were getting, which was basically libertarian and free trade and pro-Wall Street, really, in the end of the day. They saw income inequality rising as a result of that. And they said, we've had enough. And they were waiting for somebody to come up and tell them they were right. And Donald Trump arrived and said, you're right. We're going to change all that. And that was the new Republican Party. It changed from the bottom up. And I think you have to give Trump credit for being singularly the one candidate in 2016 who understood that.
So most of the book looks at the evolution from Reagan to Trump, sort of using those as sort of bookmarks, at least as I read it, as the last 2 major transformations of the Republican Party, right? Ronald Reagan was sort of, even today, to some extent, still known as sort of the godfather of the modern Republican Party because he presided over the last great transformation. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the similarities and differences between those 2 transformations.
Well, they're similar in a few ways. They're mostly different, but they're similar in a couple of ways. One is that Reagan was as much an anti-Republican establishment figure in 1976 and 1980, when the 2 times he ran, as Donald Trump was in 2016, because he rode in from the West and he basically wasn't beholden to the Republican establishment, which was kind of moderate, Jerry Ford kind of an establishment in those days. He had his own channel to the voting public. Like Trump, he was a former entertainer. He knew how to communicate. He knew how to connect in a kind of a kitchen table sort of a way. And he knew he was talking over the heads of the establishment, which didn't trust him. Trust me, Republicans didn't trust Reagan. The Republican establishment didn't as much, in much the same way they didn't trust Trump. And he talked over the heads of the establishment to the people. So all those things are the same things that Trump did. Where they are different is just about everywhere else. I mean, Reagan was a genuine conservative. He doesn't give enough credit. He was actually fairly well read. He knew what he thought. He had a philosophy. He believed in free markets, free movement of people. He believed in smaller government. He believed in he stood against strong executive power, like most conservatives do. They're distrustful of big power centers. Donald Trump is different from him in every respect on all those counts. So he's not really a conservative. What Donald Trump was doing was leading basically the same kind of revolution, but taking it in a different direction. And some people I talked to in doing the book said, oh, if Reagan were around today, he'd be just like Donald Trump. I just think that's nonsense, because Reagan actually believed in things, and he believed in things that Donald Trump opposes. He believed in the virtues of immigration. Ronald Reagan started his 1980 general election campaign by giving a speech at the Statue of Liberty in which he talked about and extolled the virtues of immigration and all that immigration had done for the country economically and socially and culturally. And I can't imagine him doing a 180-degree turn and having a Trump view of immigration, just to cite one example. Now, one area where these 2 things came together, the Reagan Revolution, the Trump Revolution, was that there are a few things that the business community wants out of a Republican. It wants a tax cut, it wants deregulation, and it doesn't want to get into any trade wars. And Donald Trump promised them a tax cut, and he delivered it. He promised them deregulation, he delivered it. And he kind of skirted a trade war, but got out of it. So you ask the question of how could that part of the Republican Party swing behind Donald Trump? Because on their priority list, they were still getting the things that really mattered to them. It was just all the rest of it that went out the window.
You talk in the book about a couple of other people sort of along the path that should have shown that, or at least in retrospect, you can be like, oh, I get it, right? Like I see how, right? You talk about Pat Buchanan, you talk about Newt Gingrich, you talk about Sarah Palin, and then less a person, more a movement. You talk about the Tea Party. Can you touch on each of those a little bit?
Right,
and where they saw on that journey?
And there's one other on the list, Ross Perot, that I would.
Ross Perot. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So all those people. So those were the signposts on this road that should have told us something. I think Pat Buchanan was the earliest and maybe the best sign that something was happening, because Pat Buchanan was a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan disciple. Worked for Ronald Reagan. Worshipped Ronald Reagan. Loved Ronald Reagan. Loved everything about Ronald Reagan. But by 1992, 4 years after Ronald Reagan had gone, he was moving on to a different kind of populist conservatism. I talked to him about it. It was a fascinating conversation. And he said, I saw factories closing. I saw jobs moving overseas. I saw working class people being hurt. And I came to a different feeling about what a conservative should be for. And he became an anti-free trade, anti-immigration, populist conservative. And a lot of people misread that because they focused on the fact that he was also a social conservative and saw him as a cultural warrior. Missed the importance of the Pat Buchanan economic message, which was an early sign that there was a different way of thinking about all this in the Republican Party.
And if I'm not wrong, with some success, right? I mean, he took a third of the vote against the incumbent Republican president in the New Hampshire primary.
Right. And he is a reason George H.W. Bush didn't win a second term. He's at least one of the reasons. The other reason George H.W. Bush didn't win a second term, and the one the Bush people blame more, is Ross Perot, who is making a similar entry at the same time as an independent and later a third-party candidate, making similar anti-establishment messages, saying essentially, the financial establishment is stacked against you, Mr. and Mrs. Average American, and I'm going to fix it. And he wanted to do it from outside the system, and Pat Buchanan was saying the same thing from inside the system, and they opened the door for Bill Clinton. And the fact is that the country wasn't quite ready then for that message, but the fact that Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot both got such traction with that message in 1992 and again in 1996 should have told us that there was a movement that seeds were planted. And then you move forward and you got basically, by the time you, and by the way, Bill McInturff is a Republican pollster who does polling for us at the Wall Street Journal and NBC News, along with Peter Hart, a Democrat, said to me at one point in 2016, he said, Donald Trump is just Pat Buchanan who owns his own airplane. You know, that's the only real difference. So the message is a straight line from Buchanan to Trump. Along the way, you also get Sarah Palin shows up, and she is an electrifying, for a time until she basically collapses of her own weaknesses and inadequacies, but she's a populist messenger for the Republican Party and was electric for a few weeks in 2008. You had the Tea Party movement in 2009, 2010, which was very much a grassroots, the establishment has fixed the game. We're going to change that. That was a very Trump-like message. People forget Mike Huckabee had a similar message in 2004, 2008, 2012. And all those things came together to basically tell us that something was happening. And I think it's important to remember that some of this was happening in the Democratic Party and the left at the same time. I mean, Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement were certainly different in the way they manifest themselves, but they weren't different in terms of their analysis of the problem. Their analysis of the problem was, we're getting screwed by the big rich guys, and the political system is designed to help them and make sure we sit down and shut up. That's Occupy Wall Street on the left, and it's the Tea Party on the right. And a lot of that filtered all the way into Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. It's a kind of a anti-establishment message that had resonance on the left and on the right. And I think because we all, and I should say I don't know about others, but I live in kind of a Washington bubble where those noises are either filtered out or not taken seriously. We should have taken them more seriously, honestly.
Yeah, and I think your point is exactly right about how, Bill, you look at Jimmy Carter, right? Back in 1976, running against a system that was fundamentally broken. You look at Bill Clinton in 1992, another outsider who was not trusted by the establishment of his own party, right? Who came in with more of a populist, I feel your pain message because the system is rigged against you. And even Barack Obama, who had a more aspirational tone in many ways, really was, again, not the establishment's first choice, but very much ran against it and the special interests. And I always tell my friends in the Democratic Party, watch what Donald Trump did, because it could be headed our way, looking very differently. But that whole anti-establishment populist movement seems to becoming more and more dominant.
Well, and I think you're right. And I would argue, you would know more than me, and maybe you disagree. I would argue that Bernie Sanders could not have gotten any traction and even a decent hearing in the Democratic Party 10, certainly 20 years ago. But by 2016, he was a viable candidate. And by 2020, he was the leading candidate. And I think it wasn't until panic set in and people swung behind Joe Biden to stop Bernie Sanders that it didn't turn out that way. But it could have, and some would argue should have. And that's as big a sea change in a way as Donald Trump was on the Republican side.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Just a reminder to our audience, we're going to be coming to you in a little bit, so feel free to continue to populate your questions into the Q&A tab, and someone will tap your shoulder. I want to go back, Jerry, a little bit before Ronald Reagan, because there are a lot of people who want to draw some parallels between Donald Trump and Richard Nixon. Particularly on some of the cultural issues, right? Law and order was very much one of the things that Richard Nixon talked about. Nixon's critics, like Trump's critics, say that his elections were predicated on dividing the electorate, right? I mean, you hear the same criticisms of both candidates. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on that as well.
Well, it's a good point. And people did tell me along the way of doing the book and sense that you could easily should start this story in 1968 with Nixon, not 1980 with Reagan, that's the real birth of the modern version of the Republican Party when they stopped being Rockefeller and Eisenhower Republicans and became Nixon, Reagan conservatives. And I think there's some validity to that. I think there's a difference between Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan in a lot of ways. And I started where I did for those reasons. But there is no doubt, if you go back to 1968, you see a fundamental change in both parties starting then. And it starts in the South. It begins with the Southern strategy that Richard Nixon pursued. And George Wallace was in there as a former Democrat, pulling away white Southern racists, frankly, from the Democratic Party and planting them in his column. And then they drifted over and became Nixon Republicans in some ways. And this was quite a conscious strategy by the Nixon campaigns in 68 and 72. And there definitely was a racism factor involved in that. And it produced a realignment of the two parties. And the two parties realigned. If you go back and look, it's a fascinating exercise to go back and look at electoral maps, states, who won which states in which elections, starting in the 60s. And you see all these blue states in the South. States that Democrats have no prayer of winning now were blue, 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 blue. That was the solid South. And in 68, it was broken up. And it was broken up specifically because of the civil rights movement and a reaction against that in the South, which Republicans swooped in and took advantage of. In addition to that, and 68 is like 2020 in the sense that there was a feeling that things were out of control. You had race riots in the streets. You had a war in Vietnam that was going badly. You had tension in the air. You had a Democratic Party that just seemed unable to control itself. And Nixon walks in with a law and order message. Well, it's not a coincidence that part of Nixon gospel has been picked up by Donald Trump. The law and order message began in 1968. Donald Trump used it, people forget, in 2016. And he's using it on steroids in 2020. So there's a playbook there that kind of developed in 1968. And it's not an accident that Donald Trump is using some of it right now. I don't know that it has the same effect, though, because the effect in 1968 was it helped Nixon throw the Democrats out of the White House and take over. But that's because the Democrats were in power. They were the incumbents. Right. They were responsible for the out of control nature of affairs, people thought. Here you have the incumbent president who's in charge when things are out of control, and he's trying to turn the let's get things back under control message to his benefit, which seems a little odd since you're already in charge, but it might work. We'll see.
Well, I mean, and it's interesting, right? I mean, because you think back to Nixon, you think back to Reagan, right? And traditional Republican conservative orthodoxy since then, the core of the message has been, we're going to rein in an out of control establishment. They weren't necessarily going to war with it. They just said, we're going to transform it. Well, now you have an incumbent president of the United States, which by definition in normal times is the establishment, still going to war with it, not trying to rein it in, just taking a sledgehammer to it in a lot of ways. Which brings me to sort of another question, which was, you know, Grover Norquist, when he was a fellow in our program, he and I had a number of conversations, and I remember talking to some students who asked if we ever thought that there would be room for a third party. And Grover was very definitive. He said no, because there have been two competing ideologies that have defined politics in the modern era. And they both have been around the size of government, right? One party believes that there should be a more activist role for government. The other party believes that there should be a much more limited role for government. And that what's the alternative to that, right? That there are really two dominant strains. What is the orthodoxy of the Trump presidency, right? Is he completely realigning not just the party, because we're going to get to the future of the Republican Party, but is he changing the conversation moving forward?
You know, that is absolutely what's happening now. Whether it takes hold or not depends on whether he wins a second term or not. But if he wins a second term, the Republican Party will be changed into something different and something significantly different. And I have throughout, look, I covered John Anderson in 1980 when he tried to run as an independent, and I covered Ross Perot twice in 92 and 96. I would have totally agreed with Grover. You can't get traction in this system as a third party candidate, partly because the system works against you, and partly for the ideological reasons. There is a reason there's a Democratic and Republican Party, and it's pretty clear. It is not clear anymore. Donald Trump is not a small government Republican. He's a big government Republican. He does not want to cut entitlement programs. He wants an ever more powerful presidency. That's a non-conservative idea. He is happy to have deficits of $1 trillion or $2 trillion or whatever we're headed for. It's of no concern to him. These are all things that the Republican Party existed to try to stop until Trump arrived. And if that's the new Republican Party, then you have a big government Republican version of politics and a big government Democratic version of politics. Then maybe there is room for a third party. And by the way, the most interesting people in this equation are the business community, the traditional, and I'm talking about big business, but also small mainstream businesses, the backbone of the Republican Party. If that's the version of the Republican Party that's going to exist going forward, is that really where the business community is going to be comfortable? Does the Chamber of Commerce want to be part of an anti-free trade, pro-deficits Republican Party? Well, probably not. Maybe they find someplace else to go. I think this whole question of whether there can be a third party is going to be rethought if Donald Trump runs a second term, just because there are a whole lot of people who are conservatives and business leaders who aren't going to feel at home in that version of the Republican Party.
You know, a lot of times when you're living through politics, when you're living through a campaign, when you're living through even decades of this stuff, to the whole point of your book, right? You miss it. You miss the moment, and you don't see it until it's in the rearview mirror. But you write in the book about the moment when you saw it, the moment when you realized that this had been a complete transformation. Talk about that moment.
You know, I have to give my wife, Barb, who may be listening in another room, credit for this, because when I started to go down this path of doing this book and trying to describe this change, she said, you need to figure out the moment when you knew everything had changed. You know, in a different way, we all knew the morning of 9/11, the world had changed. So that was a moment. What's the moment when, she asks, what's the moment when you knew things had changed, that the Republican Party had moved from a Reagan track to a Trump track? And I realized I knew it because I was standing on the floor of the Republican convention in 2016 when it happened. It happened the night when Ted Cruz, who was the last man standing trying to stop Donald Trump, gave his concession speech, essentially. And Ted Cruz had spent his entire life as a Reagan Republican, a true dyed-in-the-wool conservative, carrying the Reagan traditional conservative banner through his Senate race and into the Senate and into his presidential campaign, and he fell short. But he gets to make a primetime televised speech because that's what you do if you're the last man standing, if you're the runner-up. And so he goes to the podium at the convention, and there's this very electric air of anticipation because the relationship between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz was poisonous at that point. They had said the most horrible things about each other. And people wondered, what's he going to say? How will he treat this moment? What will he say about Donald Trump? And Ted Cruz starts speaking and talks and talks and talks and only mentions Donald Trump in passing once at the very beginning, doesn't endorse him. And as the speech goes on, people in the hall, and I was standing in front of the New York delegation, which was very Trumpian, were getting more and more restless. They want Ted Cruz to endorse Donald Trump, to say this is the new standard bearer of the Republican Party. And as it goes on, 15, 20, 25 minutes, it's clear he's not going to endorse Donald Trump. And people start yelling at Ted Cruz from the floor of the convention, say his name, endorse Trump, and he doesn't do it. And pretty soon they're booing Ted Cruz. And at that moment, Donald Trump walked into the auditorium in the back, in the seats that the family was sitting in, and all these heads turned from Ted Cruz to Donald Trump, and they cheer Donald Trump. And then they turn back to Ted Cruz, and there's a minute of booing Ted Cruz, almost a solid minute if you go back on YouTube and watch it, where he can't even talk because the boos are so loud. And then he finishes his speech, and he never endorses Donald Trump. In fact, he says basically conservatives should vote their conscience. He almost invites people not to vote for the Republican nominee, and he gets booed off the stage, basically. And at that point, it was pretty clear this party belonged to the guy standing in the back there, Donald Trump, not to the guy standing at the podium, a Reagan conservative named Ted Cruz. To me, that was the moment when power switched.
Okay, I've got more questions, Sherry, but I want to get to the good questions, those from the students. Though I will exercise the right of the moderator to maybe interject and intersperse. So let's go to the students now. When I call on you, tell us who you are, where you're zooming in from, your school and year at Georgetown, and then go ahead and ask Jerry your question directly. So with that, our first question comes from Matt. Hey, Matt. You're on mute, Matt.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you for being here. And I'm Matt. I'm calling from Arlington, Virginia. I'm in the MBA program and the Master's in Public Policy program at Georgetown. I'm curious about how the characteristics of the GOP that made it susceptible to someone like Donald Trump taking over the party in a more populist direction differ from the dynamics in the Democratic Party that prevented the Democrats from nominating a populist like Bernie Sanders. Why was there something inherently about the Republican Party that made it more susceptible to that particular moment? Well,
it's a really good question, and I think the answer is the demographic change in the Republican Party made it ripe for this to happen. You know, there's a fascinating chart in which we looked at the voting behavior of college-educated white women over the years and non-college white men over the years, and those two groups voted almost exactly the same over time. And then in the last 3 cycles, they started to separate. And now, by the time Trump arrived, the 2 lines went like this. College-educated white women went more and more Democratic. They were kind of a marginal Republican audience, actually, and they became very solidly Democratic. And non-college white men went the opposite direction in an extreme way. They became solidly Trump Republicans. And in a way, that's what happened. You know, you had a Republican Party that went from being basically suburban, and really country club, coastal, highly educated, to being over the course of one generation, the opposite of all those things. Lower education in the norm, central, not coastal, and very much dominated by angry white men to some extent. And so there was and people who, as I said before, were in the party for cultural reasons, but weren't happy with its economic recipes because they weren't working for those people. So why did the Republican Party move in this direction? Well, it's not the same Republican Party. You know, back in, and Mo will remember this, Tim Pawlenty, who was the governor of Minnesota, who was running for president in 2008, said to Republican audiences then, and he was prophetic, he said, you guys have to understand, this is not the country club Republican Party anymore. This is a Sam's Club Republican Party. And to me, that sentence captured the whole thing. And he was right. He saw it coming. And by 2016, it had become a different party. And as I said before, that opened a door, and Donald Trump just walked through that open door in many ways. So it's not an accident. It didn't happen at the top of the Republican Party. It started from the bottom up. Now, on the Democratic side, I don't have as good an answer, except that, you know, if it were a slightly different environment, Bernie Sanders would be the Democratic nominee, and then we'd have a populist of the right and a populist of the left going head to head. There are a lot of complicated reasons, including just fear of Donald Trump, that it didn't work out that way, but it could have. I mean, at least in my estimation. Mo may have a different feeling, but I think we were very close to having essentially that, a populist of the right and a populist of the left.
Thanks, Matt, for the question. Yeah, it's interesting, Jerry. I think about that often. And I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because what you just suggested was that how the demographic change within the Republican Party benefited Donald Trump. But I think the demographic changes within the Democratic Party is what kept Bernie Sanders from becoming the Democratic nominee, right? The sort of the bedrock growth sectors of the Democratic coalition, the emerging Democratic coalition, where he struggled the most in a lot of ways.
That's a good point.
And you know, that might bode well for a future AOC, right? But maybe not for Bernie Sanders.
No, because you're talking about blue coastal enclaves that tend to be higher educated and driven in many ways by a tech economy. And that's different from the Trump constituency.
Right, right. Okay, let's go to Adam next.
Hi, I'm Adam Pack. I'm a sophomore in the SFS. I'm calling in from West Virginia. And my question to you is, after researching the past trends of the Republican Party over the past 40 years, where do you think the Republican Party goes from here if President Trump loses to Joe Biden in November? What ideas do you think they fall back on, and who do you think is the best position to lead the party after President Trump?
That's a great question. And I do deal with this in the book some, and I dealt with it in a longer piece that was based on the book I did for the Journal. I think there are two different scenarios, Adam, and the answers are really important in either case. There's the scenario in which this transition away from Trump happens in 2020, and there's the scenario in which he wins a second term and it happens in 2024. And I think the answer is slightly different in each case. What's similar is that there will be a fork in the road for the Republican Party. Does it continue down the path of Trumpism, or does it basically snap back and try to go into a more conventional Republican conservative direction? And that's going to be a struggle, a fight, because whether Donald Trump sticks around because he's reelected to a second term, or if he sticks around because he's lost and he decides to have his influence by starting the Trump television network that moves to the right of even Fox News, he's not going away. That voice will be there, and there's a kind of a Trump message, a nationalist populist message that's taken root. And there's going to be a battle in the Republican Party for the soul of that Republican Party, whether that happens in 2020 or 2024. What's interesting, and what I think may be the real answer in the long run to your question, is that they don't get much attention, but they're a group of young intellectual conservatives around this town, Washington in particular. And there's some representation of them in Congress, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley in particular, who are trying to figure out a way that you can take a traditional conservative message and accommodate the new nationalist populist impulses into that. How can you bring these two things together? And that's a very fascinating process. And in the long run, that's probably where Republicans are headed. What does that mean? It means not being so libertarian in your economic policies. It means basically accepting that tax cuts and deregulation and smaller government don't work for people who are now the foot soldiers of the Republican Party, that you need things like industrial policy. You should use government power to help people, to help specific industries, manufacturing industries in particular, because they create the jobs that keep our communities and our culture together. And we as conservatives find keeping those communities and keeping our culture together just as important as the libertarian economic philosophy we've been preaching. That's where I think conservatives and Republicans are probably headed. But that's an attempt to take some of Trumpism and live with it and shave off all the rough edges. And some people aren't going to want to shave off the rough edges. So there's a struggle that's coming, and whether it's at the end of this year or 4 years from now, it could be it could be very messy for Republicans.
Thanks for the question, Adam. How much of this, though, Jerry, and when thinking about the future, right, can anyone replicate any of this? How much of this is Trumpism versus Trump the man, right? And I wonder about this a lot because, again, going back over those past 40 years, some of the most transformative political leaders on both sides of the aisle have been celebrities in some way, right? They either bring celebrity in with them, another similarity, as you referenced, between Reagan and Trump, or they manage to create an air of celebrity around them, right? A Barack Obama. And I often wonder whether or not our politics has transitioned not just from ideological to populist, but also from ideological to celebrity-driven politics. And I wonder, when you look at Trump and Trumpism, could anyone else have pulled that off? With this, if somebody else had come in and said the same exact words at the same exact time, could they have pulled it off, or was it something about him?
Well, on that last question, obviously we'll never know the answer, but I'm inclined to think that there was a market for a Trump-like message. That maybe it wasn't quite ripe in 2016, except that Trump came in and stormed in and blew everybody else away and changed the process so much. But I think the populist message was kind of ripe for the taking, and it happened to be Donald Trump. But on your broader question, there are two aspects to it. There's style and there's substance. And stylistically, has Donald Trump changed the way the presidency works, the way politics works, the way campaigns work forevermore? Will we ever go back to civilized conversation and non-Twitter debates and conversations on the campaign trail that don't happen in capital letters with exclamation points? More civilized? I don't know. I think probably we will, because I think that is uniquely Trumpian and it's kind of wearing people out, but I could be wrong about that. And then there's the substance. As I said at the beginning, there's no governing philosophy. There's no Trump governing philosophy. There's Trump instincts, and somebody may be able to add them up to a more coherent philosophy, but maybe they can't. And as I said, there are some people who are trying to create a philosophy where there is one. I think that's the great unanswered question, and I don't think we know until we see how the Trump experiment ends.
Okay, thanks. Next, we've got Graham.
Well, hi, I'm Graham Hillman. I'm a freshman in the SFS, and you actually just kind of touched on the question that I was going to ask there, which was that how much of Trump's populist appeal is really unique to Trump, and how much success will future Republican standard bearers have if they attempt to emulate Trump, despite not being Trump?
Yeah, well, it's still a good question. Let me elaborate a little bit more. And first of all, elaborate by saying I don't know the answer to your question, but it's really an important one. I think there's going to be, my guess is that if you're a Republican voter, you're going to get a choice in whenever Trump goes away. Again, whether that's after this year or 4 years down the road, you're going to get a choice. Do you want more of this style? Because there are going to be some people out there, Mo, you'll know this. I mean, imitation is the sincerest form of political flattery. And if something works for candidate A, candidate B, C, D, and E are all going to try the same thing. So there's going to be a lot of that out there. But there's also going to be some people who believe, as I do, that many successful campaigns and candidacies are reactions to what came before. They're adjustments. They're people who want to move away from what came before and try something different. So I think there's going to be, stylistically, people who are going to try to to calm things down, to become soothing voices instead of divisive voices, and to be anti-Trumps, maybe with a similar message, but with a different style. And there's going to be an attempt to go back to some more conservative, traditional conservative economic messages. Will those succeed or not? I don't know. I don't know, but there is going to be a struggle in the Democratic Party, much as there was a struggle in the Democratic Party after George McGovern lost in 1972 as a kind of proud, flag-carrying liberal, and there was a kind of a reaction to that electoral failure. But if it's an electoral success, maybe it turns out differently. I don't think we can yet separate the Trumpism that is attributable entirely to Donald J. Trump, and the Trumpism that is attributed to this populist nationalist mood I talked about. And it will be the task of Republicans in particular, and to some extent Democrats, to sort those two things out in the years after Trump is gone.
Okay, thanks, Graham, for the question. Let's bring Javon back up.
Hi, Joe. Just a quick question. So, one of the things that I've been really wondering, given the nature of the president and the conservative movement in general, is, how is this going to impact Republican voters moving forward? I mean, will people who traditionally voted Republican, like you said, starting in the 1980s, and our core voting group, will those people still continue to vote Republican? Do we see the establishment of a third way, or will the base prefer a more populist candidate going forward? I mean, I know there's discussions that have been, what does the future look like? Is it Nikki Haley? Is it a Donald Trump Jr.? So what does that look like moving forward?
Well, I think that's a really intriguing question for Republicans. And there's some sorting out happening. And this is true, by the way, of both parties. There's a kind of a sorting out happening in both parties. You're seeing some traditional Republican constituencies, suburban women most prominently among them, who were pretty decent constituencies, audiences for Republicans, now drifting away, maybe irretrievably. But you also have new constituencies that are basically becoming rock solid Republican constituencies. There are two that I find most intriguing. One is working class white men, and that's kind of obvious, and people talk about it all the time. The other is Hispanics. There is something going on right now with Donald Trump and Hispanic voters. And you've seen some stories in the press in the last week or so. And we have a new poll in the field, the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll this week, that's doing a Hispanic oversample to try to figure out what's going on. But you had a poll last week in which Donald Trump got the support of 41% of Hispanics. What is that about? What is that? I mean, given the anti-immigrant and the seeming hostility toward Hispanics that oozes out of a lot of what comes out of Trump world, how can that be so? Well, I don't know the answer to that completely, but maybe there is more traction for the populist, even the nationalist message in the Hispanic community than we all thought. Anyway, my point is there is a sorting out going that is underway in both parties. And I don't think, and some of that is happening to produce Trump, and some of it is now accelerated because of Trump. And until that sorting out is completed, I don't think we know for sure. I don't know that any Republican can tell you with any confidence that he or she knows what the makeup of the party will be 5 and 10 years from now, because there's a realignment underway. And this is, this is not unprecedented in American political history. It happens, parties change shape, they change character, they change demographically. And I think both parties are changing demographically right now. The big problem for Republicans is obviously that young voters they have no traction with young voters. And unless that changes, they have big trouble for many years to come. But it could change, just as it has in the past.
Thanks, Javon. I want to pick up on two things you've said in a couple of the past few answers. One of them about the future of the Republican electorate that we were just talking about. Trump, the president, is very fond of pointing to his approval numbers amongst Republican voters, right? But and it is incredibly high, right? No one should take that away. It is incredibly high. But at the same time, if you look at voter registration numbers in state after state, there's fewer Republicans. There are fewer people who are publicly identifying as Republicans, who are actively registering as Republicans. In a number of places, they've actually fallen to third behind independents in terms of the number of party registrations there. And so I'm wondering if, at the same time, a lot of people are kind of laughing off the Never Trump movement, saying that, the president's rock solid with Republicans, the places like the Lincoln Project are not really having an impact on this race. But I do wonder if that realignment we're seeing that you were talking about, that is yet, we won't know what it looks like until the dust settles. I guess I'm wondering whether or not it is going to strengthen the party, if it is going to reflect a weakened party, or if there's just any way to read any tea leaves, particularly as you look at how the down ballot primaries played out in 2020, and Republican congressional primaries and Republican Senate primaries. Can you see anything there?
Well, look, I think you have to distinguish between the Republican Party at the Trump presidential level to some extent and what might be happening at lower levels in the party. You know, I mentioned Hispanics. There are some very strong, appealing young African-American Republican candidates. You saw them at the Republican convention. Will they change the feeling among the African-American community about the Republican Party? And particularly among African-American men, there's some indication that they are. So I think when people look at current demographic trends, and Mo, in your party, the Democratic Party, you hear this a lot. Demography is destiny. Demographics are destiny. That assumes a straight line extrapolation from where we are now, but that's really not how the world works. It's usually not a straight line. So if Republicans stand still and don't do anything to broaden their appeal to Hispanics, to Blacks, to Asians, to young people, then yeah, they're dead, okay? It's not complicated, but they're not gonna do that. That's not how it's going to work. Nikki Haley is a very politically appealing woman of Indian American heritage. Is she the next face of the Republican Party when Donald Trump is gone? Well, that's a different kind of a face. By the way, Nikki Haley brings a kind of more traditional Reagan message in a completely different political package. That's a different picture than if Donald Trump Jr. is the Republican nominee in 2024. That's a different scenario than if Nikki Haley is the nominee. So my point is, there's nothing static in American politics. You know this better than I do. Parties change, they morph, they adapt. You know, Bill Clinton took the Democratic Party in the 1990s, and I talk about this at some length in the book, and he adapted he adapted the Democratic Party of the 1990s to the prevailing mood of the country and the electorate. It's just to say he took it to the center, and he co-opted the entire Gingrich revolution by doing so in many ways. And he was a very gifted politician, so he knew how to do this. That's what happens. Parties change, parties morph. So there is a great question about how Republicans manage the demographic problem that they have, but they're not going to do it by, I don't think, by just standing still and letting the wave crash over them and kill them. That's not the way parties work in this country.
I want to shift up for a moment, because we've spent a lot of time talking about Trump and Trumpism substantively. But I think we'd be remiss not if we didn't talk about his style. Right?
Yeah.
And, you know, should we have seen that coming, right? People all the time say, I can't believe he said that. I can't believe he did that. He's breaking all these norms. But you in the book say, actually, we should have seen that coming too, because there have been some inflection points over time.
Well, the big inflection point in this direction came not in 2016, but in 1994, when Newt Gingrich became the dominant figure in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement by engineering the Republican takeover of the House of Representatives, which was an historic achievement. And he did it because he brought to the table a much more hard-edged, aggressive, some would say mean and nasty approach to politics than, you know, Jerry Ford or even or certainly Ronald Reagan or any of his predecessors had. It was a fighting message. It was a in-your-face kind of an approach. And that was different for Republicans. And Rahm Emanuel, who you and I both know well, told me when I talked to him about the book, he said to me, the end of the Reagan era didn't come when Donald Trump was elected. It came when Newt Gingrich became the face and the voice of the party, because it was such a different approach. And it worked, right? And so you could see that coming for a while. There was a harder edge. And by the way, this then happened in both parties. And so is Donald Trump a completely alien force in that regard? No, he's kind of a continuation of a trend. He's an extreme example of a trend that was underway. I had a similar conversation with Eric Cantor, a Republican congressman from the Richmond area in Virginia, who was the #2 Republican in the House when he lost his seat to a complete political unknown, Dave Bratt, who had no money and no profile, yet he, with a very pugilistic style, he beat Eric Cantor, because Eric Cantor was seen as the face of the establishment, not just the Republican establishment, but the financial establishment, and a truly populist campaign unended him. And I asked, and he said there was so much anger in that campaign, so much anger toward me. And I asked him, I said, where did that anger come from? And he pulled out his iPhone, he held it up, and he said, it came from here. And what he meant was that there was the social media-ization, if that's a word, of the political conversation has just stoked anger. And it's made people, it's divided people and made them hateful in some respects. And it's a great way to amplify anger. You use those platforms to amplify anger, and that works against all kinds of people, including in that case, a Republican. So Donald Trump, what happened to Eric Cantor was that somebody used those kinds of tactics against him to great success. And Donald Trump arrives, and he's an opportunist in that sense. He recognizes that his style fits that environment, and he turns it up. And so that's where we are. Can somebody turn the volume back down now and stop tweeting in capital letters and exclamation points, as I said before? Or is it too late? I don't know the answer to that question.
One of the things I like about your analysis of all this is that too many people focus just on the political leaders when they're having these conversations, but you really focus on the voters and how they've driven it. And when I think about that and the story you just told about Eric Cantor, we do some polling, the battleground poll that Ed Goaz and Celinda Lake have been doing for years. One of the things that we added when it moved here to the Institute was a civility poll, where we're following voter attitude over time on the issue of civility in politics. You and I both have known, I've written a lot of scripts, you've covered a lot of candidates who will talk about the need to heal, the need for common ground and compromise. But that now is almost a dirty word, right? You don't see a lot of people. We'll see, this election will be a great experiment in that, because that is part of what Biden is saying. But our civility polls, we ask people, right? Do you want there to be more civility in politics? And everybody says, sure, sure, sure. But when we ask it a little bit differently, we ask people, agree or disagree with the two following statements. Statement number one, common ground and compromise are noble goals we want our leaders to aspire to. 87% say they agree with that. But the very next question is, agree or disagree? I'm tired of leaders who compromise on my values. I want them to stand up to the other side. 84% agree with that. And I think that sort of gets to the heart of a big part of this, right? It's that totally. Donald Trump saw a transformation in the electorate, an electorate that kind of wants someone who will stand up to the establishment, stand up to the system, not just the other side, but the whole damn kit and caboodle.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in fact, I tell people this a lot, because I get annoyed when people say, well, when will this divisiveness end? When will this nastiness end? And I say, if you're a voter, it ends when you say it ends, because you have to reward people for not being that politician. And that's not happening. Politicians are like the rest of us. They will adapt to survive. If they have to adapt to survive by being more moderate and soothing and being willing to compromise, that's what they'll do. But that's not the signal they're getting from voters. They're getting the one that you just described. Dig in your heels, fight the fight, go after those bad guys. That's what, until voters change their mind about that, politicians aren't going to change. And a lot of the things I write about in the book, as you suggest, or come from the bottom up, not from the top down. I have this conversation periodically with people about Trump. And people say, well, how could the Republican Party possibly turn to Donald Trump? What is wrong with those people who run the Republican Party? Because they hate Trump. And I say, well, what about the 60 million Americans who voted for him? It wasn't some Republican meeting in a room on Capitol Hill. It was primary after primary after primary after primary where Republican voters decided they wanted Donald Trump. And if you're not happy with that, talk to your countrymen about it. And if you're not happy with the divisive nature and the nastiness in American politics, try to reward somebody when you vote who doesn't practice that. That's the way this changes. And so it's kind of a cop-out to say it's somebody else's fault. It's a democracy, and voters get to say. And if they don't like it, that's what they should do. They should vote somebody They vote for somebody who brings a different formula to the table.
Well, we've got 7 weeks to see what voters say about the next chapter, and whether Trumpism continues, or whether we start to see yet another transformation. And then we'll have to bring you back, Jerry, to look at those results and ask the question if we should have seen them coming or not.
Exactly.
Jerry Saad, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I encourage everyone who tuned in tonight, or who watches this later when we put the broadcast out online, that to go to Amazon or your favorite bookstore and purchase a copy. It's a good and it's an important read. So thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And to all of you in the audience, thank you for joining us tonight for our first political page-turner event of the year. Stay tuned. We'll be making some announcements soon about not just other book events, but other events in our forum. So with that, thank you all and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.